Well, the original intention of Remembrance Day was to commemorate the anniversary of the signing of the armistice, marking the end of World War I. The wearing of poppies was a symbol of the flowers that grew over the top of soldiers' graves across Western Europe. As the line in the poem says, in Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. So how did such a human catastrophe, in which 8.5 million lives were lost, reach a conclusion? Military historian, documentary maker and author Dr Will Davies is an expert on this topic, and he joins us right now. Will, thanks for your time. What was the Australian situation at the end of October, early November in 1918?
Well, the Australians had been out of the line for, by the time of the armistice, they'd been out of the line and active fighting for about a month. They'd won it, or they'd been part of the success in breaking the Hindenburg line, and once that had happened, they were moved back to rest areas and their training continued. They were just preparing. The war was going on. They had no real idea that these negotiations and this possibility was, you know, around the corner. And so in their mind, all they looked for was a chance to finish the war and get home to Australia.
What were the German initiatives? What were the German initiatives for peace in late 1918, and when did those negotiations begin?
Well, really the beginning of the end came for the Germans on the 8th of August 1918, when the great British offensive called the Battle of Amiens started. Australians were crucial in that vanguard, and they pushed the Germans back, and that really was the beginning of the end. As Ludendorff said, this was a black day of the German army. They fell back, but there was also discontent at home. That the blockage of the sea blockage by the British Navy had ensured that there were no raw materials coming into Germany. The people were starving. The troops were suffering their own concern because they knew their families were suffering. And the morale was low. You had this cascading collapse of Bulgaria and Turkey and Austria, so the allies of Germany were starting to fall out. And even at the end of September, Ludendorff and Hindenburg spoke to the Kaiser and said, look, you know, there's not much left in this war, and I think we should look to use the American 14 points and sue for a peace, negotiate a peace. So
tell us about the Australian tunnellers who were in action just 6 days before the end of hostilities, right?
They were. As I said, the Australian Army was out of it, but the tunnellers, the Australian Flying Corps and some of the artillery were still in action. Now, these tunnellers were given the task of laying a metal bridge across a lock, the concrete sides of a lock, to allow tanks to cross. So this was under fire. And this was a very dangerous and difficult, they're carrying heavy beams and timber, and they're doing this with Germans literally firing at them. In that action, 5 Australians were killed, which was, you know, when you think 6 days before the end of the war, very, very unfortunate and very sad.
Yeah. On the day of the armistice, where were the Australians when the news came through, and how did they celebrate?
Well, really the Australians were, as I said, well behind the line. The problem was the armistice was finally signed off at 5 a.m. on the 11th of November. And it was decided that the 11 o'clock was the ceasefire. And so getting that information from the highest command levels to the divisional units, and then having that information spread among the battalions took time. They didn't have radios or phones, they had field telephones, and so there were units that didn't even hear about it on the day. They perhaps heard about it, or they knew the French civilians were celebrating, but they didn't quite believe it. I mean, they'd been at war for 4 years. They couldn't imagine, many of them, that it'd ever end at all. But they were very quiet in their celebrations generally. They remembered their mates, and although they did join with the French and drink wine and have a bit of a jolly time, there was a sense of reverence and a quiet rather a quiet celebration in many cases.
Yeah, bittersweet. And news today, Will, more than a century after his death, the body of a Victorian soldier killed in action during the First World War has been identified. The family of Lieutenant James Kennedy now know that an unnamed grave in France was his final resting place, where he can be given the memorial he deserves. And currently, Will, the race is still on to identify the final 84 unknown soldiers from the Battle of Fromelles in 1916, right?
There is. I mean, this is an amazing piece of detective work and science. And here, first of all, we didn't even know these men where they were. They disappeared. The story of the Battle of Fromelles, the story of the Pheasant Wood burials by the Germans is an extraordinary story, as is the discovery by this wonderful man in Melbourne, Lambus. But gradually they've been able to, through DNA, to identify the graves. Now I've got there's varying numbers of how many are left unidentified. Of the 250 graves they extracted, 225 were Australians, and they've all... I tried to check the Commonwealth War Graves site to find out how many. I heard that there were 59 unidentified, which is fantastic out of 225. They've gone from 250 unknown, known under God graves to something like 180 or something of that order that have been identified.
Great closure for the family, isn't it?
Oh, it's wonderful, mate. And people say to me on my tours, why do we consider this? Why don't we leave them in the ground? Regularly, I have people who talk about not their great-grandfather or their great-uncle or someone, their uncle. That's my uncle up on the Menin Gate, or that's my uncle on the National Memorial. And that pain is still close to the surface for many families.
Yeah, very, very true. Will Davies, thank you very much for your time.